Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Joan B. Kroc School of Peace Studies. The Kroc School is what we like to call the global hub for peace building and social innovation, and we're going to hear a lot about both of those things tonight. My name is Andrew Blum. I'm the executive director of the Institute for Peace and Justice here within the Kroc School. At the Institute, we're the bridge between theory and practice. We are dedicated to developing the learning needed to foster new and powerful approaches to ending cycles of violence and building peace. And that's why we're so excited about tonight's event. Tonight is both a distinguished lecture series event and also the keynote for the 2017 California Consensus Conference, or CalCon. Over the next 2 days, the Kroc School, in collaboration with the One Earth Foundation, will be hosting the 2017 CalCon. The CalCon conference is driven by the belief that by bringing social scientists and practitioners and innovators and technologists together, we can create new solutions to address some of the biggest challenges of our time, including that of violence, violent extremism, and other challenges we face around the world. At CalCon, participants will work with innovative leaders from a diverse range of sectors to develop these new solutions and kickstart partnerships that will apply these solutions out in the field where it's going to matter. And that's why we're so excited to be hosting this conference, because that's what we're all about, is taking the best ideas and getting them out in the world to create real solutions. So I want to take a moment to thank the sponsors of CalCon. Our lead sponsor and partner is One Earth Foundation. We're also working with the Alliance for Peacebuilding, Build Up, CIPRI. Thanks to Chip House and Donald E. Willis, who are also sponsors of the event. I also want to thank all of the supporters of the Kroc School and the Institute for Peace and Justice, some of which are in the room here. It is your support that make events like this possible. Our speaker tonight is Shamil Idriss, the CEO of Search for Common Ground. Here at Kroc, as you've heard, we're committed to this idea of social innovation. And Shamil has been working on this social innovation space for years, maybe even before there was a name, maybe even before we called it social innovation. The first time I met Shamil, he was working for an organization called Celia that did groundbreaking work on building cultural exchange online in the digital space between Americans and youth in the Middle East. The organization he leads now, Search for Common Ground, is the leading peace-building organization in the world. I think that's safe to say. It has 59 offices around the world, and I just read on their website today, 800,000 participants move through their programs each year. So his organization truly has a global reach. His topic tonight is coming together and falling apart, how tech is impacting peace and conflict. Just so you know how today is going to go, Shamil will speak for about 30 minutes. Then I'll join him back up on stage. I'll ask some questions. We'll have some mics for you to ask questions. We're being live streamed and we're on Twitter as well. So we're going to try to take some questions from Twitter. If you're online, you can use the hashtag CalCon or Tech for Peace if you want to join that conversation online as well. This conversation we're going to have tonight about tech and peace, tech and conflict, it's a really important time to be having this conversation. I recently read an article in Wired magazine about the recent South by Southwest conference. Which is all about tech and innovation and, this sort of hopeful optimism. South by Southwest has always been this sort of, there's been this hopeful optimism about tech and its ability to solve problems. But the Wired article talked about how reflective the conference was this year and how people are really challenged thinking through what are the promises and perils of tech. And I want to read two quotes from this article that I think sum this up. The first is from a National Security Council member in the Obama administration. And he said, if I hear somebody say we're going to hack the refugee crisis, I'm going to lose my bleeping mind. And he didn't say bleeping, but what does this mean? You know, we're past time that we think tech is going to swoop in with easy solutions to complex problems. The second quote is from former Vice President Biden, who said, many of you are developing technologies and innovations for purposes large and small, fun and serious, entertaining and life-saving, but you can all have a profound impact. So, a moment to reflect on the power of tech and how we use that power to solve real problems. Not blind faith in technology, but smart people solving real problems with powerful tools. That's what we're going to talk about tonight. That's what CalCon is about. And I can't think of a better person to help us talk through this, to help us think through this, than Shamil Idriss. So please help me in welcoming Shamil.
Thank you. Great. Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you all for being here. It's really such a pleasure for me. I want to thank everybody at the Joan Kroc School of Peace Studies and at this institute. This intersection of innovation, technology, and peace building is an area that's incredibly ripe with potential and much too devoid of actual content. And I think that's going to begin changing because I believe that this year in particular is a watershed year, more so for the tech leadership community than for peace builders. And I think that offers real hope for the future. We have in the room today people who are going to be participating in the CalCon event over the next couple of days, some real ingenious change makers and innovators and people who've got great startup ideas on how to use technology for everything from early warning around electoral violence, participatory governance and participatory budgeting, games for peace building, all kinds of extraordinary things. So I'm really inspired to have you all in the room. But you are much too much the exception today than the norm. And it really begs the question why there isn't more collaboration between the tech sector and the international peace building field. After all, if you care about peace building, which is fundamentally about building relationships and transforming relationships, there's no better time in human history to be alive when more people than ever before are connected and we have, at least in theory, the capacity to communicate and collaborate across boundaries that we never could before. So why is there not more collaboration? Tonight, I want to talk about why I don't think there has been enough to date, why I think there will going forward, and some of the challenges and the opportunities that around which I think we can really collaborate and innovate across peace building and technology sectors. Partnerships tend to work best across sectors when sector leaders see in the other sector something that is mission critical. And I think increasingly people in the peace building field, people in pretty much any field over the last 10 years, had begun to realize the critical importance and the value of leveraging technology because it's so transformed our world and has become so ubiquitous. On the other hand, I think the leadership from the tech sector, for the most part, has largely considered the engagement in peace building as a philanthropic endeavor, not at all as mission critical. And I think that's beginning to change. And before going to some of the changes, I do need to acknowledge and really celebrate the philanthropy. Philanthropy gets a bad name today because everyone's looking for market solutions to everything. Philanthropy is still a really extraordinary way of living out values in today's world. And we've seen some of the most extraordinary philanthropy, including to the peace building field, coming out of the tech sector. eBay alone gave rise to the Omidyar network and foundations, to Jeff Skoll and the Skoll Foundation and all the initiatives that he and his institutions support. The Search for Common Ground, my organization, has been a partner and beneficiary of their support, as well as the Bezos Family Foundation. But these are all philanthropic endeavors. Extraordinary, most welcome, hope they continue forever and grow, but quite different from the core business of the expanding and incredibly successful tech sector. And I'm reminded a little bit of the extractives industry. You know, we at Search for Common Ground and other peace-building organizations around the world are working increasingly with the extractives industry, the mining companies, the oil companies, et cetera. And you know you've made an important and significant shift when you have a relationship, as we do with one of the largest gold mining companies now in East Africa, that shifts from their CSR, their corporate social responsibility department, or their PR department, that shifts into their core business. When they start supporting and engaging with you and partnering with you out of their community affairs and security department, rather than just the PR department. That shift has not yet been accomplished to enough of an extent between the peace-building sector and the real giants in the tech sector. I also want to give one other caveat, which is to recognize those people who are in the room who are at the forefront of this. I don't want to just focus on who's not here. We should really celebrate who is here, because these are the pathfinders. C5 Capital, which has supported the PeaceTech Accelerator at the U.S. Institute of Peace. One Earth Future, which has largely made this possible and is supporting a lot of research in this space and trying to really understand how we leverage innovation and technology for the purposes of peace building. But I do want to ask, is there anybody from Facebook, Google, Amazon, Instagram, anyone here? No. So why are they not here? And why do I believe they are going to be here next year and increasingly so going forward? You know, Andrew commented on the reflective nature at the South by Southwest Festival. I've had a lot of conversations with tech leaders as we've been looking at how we integrate technology into our work around the world. And these all lead me to believe that there is really a ground shifting going on under the tech sector. But perhaps the most obvious and public manifestation of this is Mark Zuckerberg's letter in February to the Facebook community, the 5,700-word treatise that asserted that Facebook's mission going forward cannot simply be to connect people, but to create certain kinds of communities. What kinds of communities? Supportive communities, informed communities, safe communities, civically engaged communities, and inclusive communities. This could have been a mission statement out of any one of a number of organizations that I've worked for or that I lead now. And it really represents something I think that is much more profound than a marketing statement. I certainly hope that it does, not just for Facebook, but for the tech sector more generally. It goes without saying, but I will say it, that creating those kinds of communities is exactly what leadership in the peace-building field actually knows something about, knows a lot about. And I think it needs to be stated and restated, because we sometimes look at the world and think that it's going to hell. I think it's quite important to recognize the fact that the investments that were made in the conflict resolution and peace-building architecture after the Second World War have been, by pretty much any measure, extraordinarily successful in reducing the number of deaths in real numbers and per capita, and in reducing interstate conflicts, violent conflicts. The UN and all the similar machinery is struggling mightily to deal with modern manifestations of conflict, which now are not just interstate, but substantially are made up of intrastate conflicts, poor governance, stateless extremist movements, and all other kinds of matters that governments alone simply cannot handle. But it does bear remembering that that sector has been quite successful, and we should not forget that. Now, why is 2017 a watershed year? I think here in the States, but this is having reverberations because Silicon Valley has global reverberations. I think the 2016 election and how the campaigns played out has had a profound impact. There's a lot more discussion now within the tech sector of particularly the phenomenon of filter bubbles. You know, are the algorithms that Google uses to give you information, are those algorithms keeping you only informed by those sources that reinforce your pre-existing worldviews because you've clicked on them before, so you're going to continue to be getting fed them. Facebook, when Facebook introduced the news feed, Facebook really transformed from the largest social network ever to history's largest source of information. And therefore, the fake news phenomenon, which really came to the fore in the US with the last elections, really has shaken, I think, the foundation of people in Facebook's notions of the impact that they're having in the world. I had the honor to work with some of the bravest peace builders you'll ever meet in Burundi shortly after the civil war there. And fake news was all just as prevalent at that time. Fake news was used incredibly effectively to foment genocide in Rwanda. But we're now seeing it on a global scale through some of these platforms. And so this has started to shake the foundation in the tech sector of the self-image, of the positive impact that connectivity alone can have, and more generally, the reduction in trust and social cohesion that we're seeing around the world. Again, if you look at the US alone, in peace building, we look at sort of vertical cohesion and horizontal cohesion. You can cut it a lot of different ways, but horizontal cohesion is sort of the set of relationships, trust, cooperation across communities, across demographics, between Republicans and Democrats, between people of different races, people of different religious identities, people of different ethnicities. And you look in the United States, the Southern Poverty Law Center has tracked an increase in enrollment in hate groups, doubling over the last 20 years in the US alone. And then you look at vertical cohesion. What's the quality of relationships and trust between citizens and the institutions that govern and serve them? And other than the military, pretty much every institution in the US right now is at near historic lows in terms of citizens' trust in those institutions. Congress, police, media sources, even religious institutions. And trust and cohesion are sort of the fundamental building blocks of any functioning society, certainly a functioning democracy. And we see very similar dynamics worldwide in the growth in identity-based nationalist politics and extremism. This is why the title of the talk is Coming Together and Falling Apart, because we're more connected than ever before, but boy, are we struggling to come together across some of our dividing lines here at home and around the world. Now, importantly, that polarization is happening at exactly the moment in human history when we arguably need more collaboration than ever before. And again, I go back to Zuckerberg's letter. He starts it by rightly pointing out that if we're going to solve any of the major problems that we have today, we're going to have to generate cooperation. Cooperation oftentimes across traditional dividing lines. You can't deal with climate change if only a few nations take action. You can't deal with nuclear nonproliferation. You can't deal with any of the big issues before us if you're not able to generate cooperation between nations, between peoples, between the public and private sector, across cultures. So he got that, I think, quite right as the starting point for his letter. And so I want to just sort of share with you 3 barriers that I see to greater tech sector leadership in this space, where I also think peace builders have a great deal to offer and can maybe show the pathway to tech leaders. I have to say that as I say this, I'm going to have to acknowledge I'm really an outsider to the tech sector. I talk to a lot of them. I learn a lot from them. I'm near a Luddite. I'm technically inept. But I want to share 3 of the barriers that I see looking from the outside at this field, and then 3 lessons that I want to pull out from the peace building sector that suggest some questions around which I think if the tech sector and the peace building communities came together and began to innovate together, we could tackle some of the world's biggest problems to unprecedented effect. First, the barriers. Again, from an outsider perspective, there's the near all-consuming focus on, service to, and faith in individual preferences and appetites above all else in the tech sector. The notion that connectivity alone will lead to good things, that making more immediately available to people every appetite and passion. You want something, you can buy it right now. If you see something that stirs your emotions, you can share it with a click. You go on YouTube, the motto is broadcast yourself. That somehow this will lead to a better informed, happier, healthier communities. And to be fair to the major companies in the tech sector, it hasn't really been any of their missions to create fairer, safer world. So that needs to be acknowledged up front. However, when pressed on the social impact of the revolution in technology and interactive media technologies, in particular, social media platforms, et cetera, the default has oftentimes been we're empowering individuals, and empowering individuals at scale will ultimately have a very positive effect. And it reminds me, when I went to high school, there was a course my senior year in high school that only seniors were allowed to take, and it was a philosophy class with this great teacher. And we spent the whole semester on Plato's Republic. And he started it by saying, none of you are smart enough to challenge Plato, so you're going to spend the whole semester trying to understand him. But then if you get excited about him, then go to college and study again, and you can start asking a lot more questions. So it was his way of challenging us. But I remember, I'll never forget, it was the first time, when Plato talks about the best forms of governance, right? And I don't remember them all now, I'm sorry to say. But I do remember that democracy was sort of the last rung before anarchy. And it was the first time I had seen anybody talk about democracy as anything other than fantastic and the best obvious form of government. And I think a similar kind of challenge needs to be brought to the question of enabling personal preference and appealing to base desires on a mass scale, somehow something that's going to bring positive results for those individuals or people at large. The second barrier, I think, which really kind of informs the first, is the preoccupation with scale above all else. The best way to reach scale is certainly not to encourage people to experience discomfort. Discomfort and uncertainty happen to be usually pretty critical elements of any educational experience or any experience that allows you to really develop as a human being or a citizen in a diverse society, let alone a diverse world. And it's interesting that I was thinking about this just before I came out. It might not work for you, but as I was thinking about sort of the multilateral system that's been so effective in dealing with wars, since World War II and trying to prevent war and advance all other kinds of the development agenda, that system, and the UN probably as the biggest marker of that system, developed in almost the exact inverse way as the tech sector exploded. People came together across great differences to first figure out what kind of society do we want to live in. Read the UN Charter. These are the values that we're going to try and promulgate that don't exist today, but that we're going to stand for together. And now we're going to figure out how to connect all the players that are critical to creating that kind of society. They stayed mainly at the government sector because back in those days, governments were seen as the be-all and end-all to drive that change. And we now know that that's, especially in today's world, woefully inadequate, and governments are really limited, and you need the private sector, and you need individual citizens, et cetera. But it sort of came as sort of establishing that kind of society first, and now let's connect everyone who can make that happen. Whereas the tech sector exploded by trying to connect everyone and essentially figuring, when asked, that community norms and values would kind of work themselves out along the way. Both are falling short now. The main institutions of peace building are really struggling to deal with modern manifestations of conflict. And the tech industry is getting better and better at connecting everyone, but realizing that the results of that connectivity are often not so good for society, actually. And at the intersection of these two sit citizen peace builders, who are both users of these platforms and technologies, and experts in what it takes to help create and facilitate the emergence of certain kinds of communities. It would be helpful, I think, if we found out what produces profound impact online, what produces profound change in a positive direction for individuals or communities online, and then try to scale that, rather than try to scale the participation and then figure out how we turn it into something positive for mankind. And the third barrier that I want to raise is that as the tech sector reflects and determines whether or how to embrace a commitment to foster certain kinds of community, and again, Zuckerberg's letter put it right out there. These are the kinds of communities that we want. And I think he should be celebrated for that because he's been attacked like crazy for all kinds of reasons, but I think it's a very positive step. But as the tech sector sort of figured out, okay, so how are we going to, as those who stepped out and said, we want to actually create a certain kind of community, how are we going to do it? I think there's a notion that they're facing a choice, which is actually, I think, a false choice. And I think the peace building community globally understands that this is a false choice. The false choice is that on the one hand, you can be impartial, sort of neutral and irrelevant, right? The Pepsi ad recently that got some of you could sort of say, I didn't think that was the worst thing in the world. I just thought it was really inconceived and ineffectual. But impartial and irrelevant, having no teeth or anything relevant to say. Or you can be relevant but alienating. And nobody wants to be alienating when you're running a company that's trying to connect everybody around the world or to draw people to your platform. I believe citizen peace builders offer ways and a track record of how to be relevant and powerful without being alienating, of demonstrating the kind of change that makes allies out of adversaries, building relationships to drive change that really sticks. Because in an interconnected and interdependent world, win-lose approaches, this adversarial approach to social change, ultimately leads lose-lose outcomes. As for the three lessons from the peace-building field that I want to share with you, the first really come out of, there are a couple things in the first one I want to share that we've learned from the virtual exchange programming that Andrew mentioned in his introduction to me, where we really sort of experimented with different ways of using interactive media technologies to connect young people across the US, Western Europe, and Muslim-majority countries for in-depth facilitated dialogue that would really seek to transform their attitudes towards one another and increase their cross-cultural empathy and collaboration and communication skills. We've had great success with this programming. It ultimately it was the basis for which, as Andrew mentioned, we advocated for the establishment of a new category of funding called virtual exchange funding. And President Obama in 2015 announced the first dedicated fund for virtual exchange. And now the European Union, which is the world's largest funder of exchanges, has also followed suit. That's great. We can connect more people than ever before to have a profound cross-cultural experience. But we learned two things from the neuroscience team with whom we worked to evaluate the impact of this programming. And it was something that our facilitators, because every one of these dialogue groups is facilitated by people who have to go through more than 20 hours of training from us to get in that room and facilitate these small online video conference dialogue sessions. We learned that the critical threshold for people to pass through, the radically critical threshold for people to pass through in order to become more open to engaging with difference is not the experience of being agreed with by the other side. It's the experience of being heard and respected by the other side, especially when you say something that you anticipate you're going to get shut down for. So when, every semester we run this program and someone says, or people say, I don't think extremism or terrorism is a fringe phenomenon in your society, I think your religion is violent. Or somebody else says, I don't think the September 11th attacks happened the way you think they did, I think your government organized them. And these are actually quite mainstream views across these societies, but they don't get surfaced. They certainly don't get surfaced in conversation with people and facilitated dialogue with people. And what we found is that when the reaction to that is not to shut them down, but is people saying, I completely disagree with you. I'm even maybe hurt a little bit by what you just said, but I need to understand where you're coming from. Did you have a personal experience that led you to think that way? What are you worried about that makes you so scared of my community, whatever it might be? The shift that happens after that exchange every single time leads to a completely different kind of group interaction for all the sessions after that. One where people ask more questions. One where people begin to acknowledge that maybe their communities have something to do with the negative dynamics that are going on. And that's a profound shift. So one of the questions I think it would be very interesting to noodle over with tech investors and tech leaders is, how do you scale up for people the experience of being heard and respected genuinely? And how do we diversify and vastly expand the number of people who are actually willing to hear and respect views with which they disagree? These are not tech-only challenges. These are human challenges. But in the tech sector where this connectivity is being fueled and supported, I think there might be real insights. The second thing, insight from the peacebuilding field that I want to share is to really segment off in people's minds this notion that peacebuilding is one of many good causes. That you've got peacebuilding, and then you've got climate change and poverty eradication and disease eradication. That's one way to think of peacebuilding. And even if you think of it in that way, I would argue that peacebuilding is issue number one. Because I think without stable societies and security societies, all other measures of development, human development, go to zero. And in fact, once violence breaks out on a scale like we're seeing in Syria today or Yemen or elsewhere, those measures all go to zero, sometimes for a full generation, with the trauma and the infrastructure destruction and everything else that happens as a result. But I think more central and more accurate of what our field has to offer, and that I think the tech sector and tech leadership really should be thinking about and engaging with us around, is the reality that in an interconnected world, this default to adversarial approaches to change does not work. At best, you yield one side winning for a short period of time while the other side licks its wounds and mobilizes to overcome you. We're seeing this in spades in this country and in countries around the world. Much more profound is understanding that there are different approaches to social change. And in fact, the most profound and effective approach to social change today in an interconnected world is an approach that starts by seeking the issue, identifying the issue that you care most about. But instead of taking a next step of finding everyone who agrees with you, everyone who disagrees with you, and going to war, you ask the question, who are all the stakeholders who are going to be affected by the outcome of this, by how this plays out, whether it's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or it's the climate change issue or whatever it might be, and finding ways to get into relationship with all of those players and begin initiating dialogue and discussion and problem solving and cooperation across those barriers. It takes a lot more patience, but the results you get at the other end stick much longer. I had the pleasure about a month ago of meeting Bono, and I like his music, But the thing I was most excited to meet with him about, if you've never read the story, it's in The Guardian, but it's been told elsewhere, about how Bono engaged with the arch-conservative senator from North Carolina who passed years ago now, Jesse Helms, on the issue of debt relief in Africa. It's one of the best examples of this collaborative approach to social change that you'll see, especially from celebrities. Not because there's anything wrong with celebrities, but celebrities tend to take shortcuts because they're leveraging their celebrity. But Bono spent hours getting to know Jesse Helms, meeting with him in private. He refused to listen to his guitarist, The Edge, and other people who urged him to please stop. He talked with Helms and asked him questions and learned what was important to him. He shared what was important to him. They talked about the Bible and the values that they took out of the Bible. At one point, Helms reported breaking down and crying. And Helms' decision to ultimately become one of the lead champions for debt relief in Africa came directly out of that kind of interchange, right? So I don't want to give Bono credit for debt relief in Africa, but one of the things that's interesting, I'd like to give him some, but one of the things that's interesting is if you look at the kind of support for debt relief, for PEPFAR, the things that have really endured across the partisan divides in this country, those issues that came out of that approach to social change have endured as well as any other investments in social good that come out of this country. So what question does that raise for us? How do you incentivize and enable the creation of communities around some of our bigger challenges? In his letter, Zuckerberg puts a lot on the fact that Facebook should now be focusing not just on how many people are connected, how soon are they going to hit 2 billion, and then how quickly can they get to 4 billion, but are they enabling people to create meaningful communities? How do you gauge a meaningful community? One way to gauge a meaningful community, and I believe one of the ways that is looked at is, a community that people spend a certain amount of time on. I think the much more interesting way to gauge a meaningful community are what are the issues and problems which, if solved, could make life better for everybody? And how can the tech sector and the peace-building community work together to foster meaningful communities on some of our biggest problems that bridge those divides and enable collaboration across those dividing lines? The third and final lesson that I want to share out of the peace-building field, and this is a real challenge, and this is one of the areas where I think when you're looking at scale, particularly at the scale that the tech sector oftentimes looks at scale, billions, right? Is a real challenge to explore, is the critical and irreplaceable role of the mediator or facilitator. If we are going to wait on the major pressing issues of the day for all the parties on that conflict, especially the ones who have hurt each other or totally disagree with each other or are offended by one another, to voluntarily decide that they want to come together to tackle that issue, we're never going to get there. I think every generation thinks their problems are the biggest. I get that. But we have a human history of not achieving breakthroughs until we have breakdowns. And we cannot afford a breakdown on nuclear nonproliferation. We can't afford a breakdown on pandemics the way they would spread today. We can't afford a breakdown on any one of the major issues that confront us. And so we've got to find a much more proactive and aggressive way to try and facilitate cooperation on these issues. And the only way that I can think of is to have some investment and growth in the talent and the capacity of facilitators and mediators. They are all over the world. One thing that anyone here who's worked in peacebuilding knows is when you look for these people, you find them everywhere. You find them in war zones, you find them look in your family. There's some natural bridge builder who, when your mother and her sister want to kill each other, that person steps in. And without being trite about it, there's more investment now. We've seen, Facebook's been creating some partnerships around with news sources and to try and create some editorial eye to sort of prevent the fake news proliferation. There needs to be a similar investment, at least, in the capacity and that facilitators bring to try and deal with some of these problems. What do? They help to frame issues in ways that everyone can come to the table, because they listen, first and foremost, to everyone's interests and what's driving and motivating them, right? They help communities to establish and form some of the norms, right? The ground rules for how they're going to engage with one another and help the community to enforce those norms. But perhaps most importantly, and I think this is the uncomfortable truth, but it has to be said, they're the ones that hold the vision until the parties themselves take it over. That sounds soft, but that's the critical piece. They're the ones who are saying, I see a divide that could bring this entire community down between the police and the youth, or between black and white, or Muslim and Jewish, or whatever. And I'm going to engage proactively to try and bridge those divides and bring those communities together. And at some point in that process, if it's successful, the community themselves takes it over from that mediator or facilitator. Any successful mediator or facilitator will tell you that. So there needs to be, I think, the question with the tech sector of how do we enable and empower those natural mediators and facilitators? What products, what plugins to the most used platforms that we have, what tools, what kind of innovation can support and really elevate the influence of that kind of mediator and facilitator community? So I just want to end by saying, I think, if leadership in the tech sector begins to get explicit about the kind of communities that they want to help create, as Zuckerberg has, and is willing to listen to some of the lessons that peace builders have of how we've been able to create those kinds of communities in the physical world, we could then have, I think, an incredibly generative and innovative collaboration on how to leverage these technologies to much greater peace-building effect, which will help everybody in the world. And what I'm excited about is not just that letter, but a lot of the conversations I've had and the reflection at South by Southwest that Andrew talked about. I think for the first time since this explosion of tech platforms and innovations, I think leadership in the tech sector and tech innovators and investors are really beginning to see that this actually is mission critical. It's not just a philanthropic endeavor. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. Really a lot to chew on. I'm going to take the sort of moderator's privilege and ask a few questions, but then I really want to leave plenty of time for the audience to ask some questions and even bring some questions in online. One of the the place I wanted to start, because of talking about the online space, your experience with Solia, this work you've done on sort of online facilitation and moderation. What do you see as the fundamental difference in our communication online versus in person? Because a lot of folks would still say, you need that face-to-face contact.
Yeah.
Is there a fundamental difference? How do you think about the nature of communication online versus face-to-face?
Anonymity doesn't help a whole lot with humanizing communication. People can be a lot nastier to each other and they're anonymous. The fact that we use a web video conferencing platform for these young people to actually see one another is really quite important. And I think it does have a moderating influence on what they will talk about. What we've seen, and we train our facilitators, pretty intensively. They more often have to support people to say what they're really thinking than they are having to rein back in a bomb thrower who said something nasty. Once you get people sort of facing one another and getting to know one another a little bit, the tendency is to want to be liked and to not disrupt generally. And so more often than not, much more often than not, what we find is people are being very, whether you want to use the term politically correct or not. And so our facilitators work quite hard to steer the conversations into the curb a little bit, as we say. Not in a hugely provocative or unfair way, but when you see somebody kind of wanting to say something but not. And so I think that's I think anonymity doesn't help. I also think in conflict resolution processes generally, it helps a whole heck of a lot, to get to know something about somebody and form some connections with somebody before you start talking about the issue that makes your blood boil across the dividing lines. So we don't start those programs. The Connect program for us goes over 8 sessions, 2 hours a week for 8 weeks. The first session, we start with identity games, all different kinds of identity games. Think of 3 things that identify who you are. They can be silly or profound to you. They could be the fact that you're a Yankee fan. They could be the fact that you're Muslim. They could be the fact that you have 6 sisters, whatever it is. And then drop 2 of those and hold on to one that you really want to share with this group. And now we're going to go around and share which of the 3 that you had and why did you hold on to the one that you held on to today, understanding that tomorrow you might pick a different one. And what we find through that kind of process is people make all kinds of connections that they might not have expected. And that makes it much more likely that the next day and the next day after that, when the difficult issues do come up, they form some sort of at least baseline of respect and interest in one another. And I think that exists. That's all. You need that in the physical space. You need that in the online space. How do you create that in the online space? Is there an automated way to create that on the online space? We looked at. We'd love to experiment more in that space, but right now it's vitally important to have good facilitation.
I wanted to also pick up on something you said about that vertical piece, that citizen engagement with the government, because I do think a lot of people still see peace building as this intergroup, as relationship building, that horizontal piece. What do you see as the most promising applications for tech in that sort of citizen engagement space? Or, what are the new ideas emerging in that space that I really think, us peace builders are realizing is equally important to the horizontal?
Yeah, we're seeing, and I think there's some of these ideas are sitting around the room here. People who have some startups, and where there's some that are helping register voters through social media platforms. There are some apps and applications of technology that are trying to ensure that elections come off safely, and there are some that enable citizen participation in budgeting processes for municipalities, or whatever it might be, that therefore gives them the real feeling and the reality of having their voice heard. There are others that enable elected officials, or even if they're not elected, officials that are responsible for local governance to be in more regular and constant communication and getting much more regular feedback from local communities. There hasn't been, in my view, yet enough that is applied to, for instance, the political process here in the lead up to elections. There are all kinds of formats I'd love to see beyond just let's take a question off of Facebook, or let's take a question off of Twitter. That's fine, but it would be really nice to see some approaches that experiment with different dialogue rather than simply adversarial debate styles. So there's a lot, I think, going on in that space. In the peace building sector, I would say it is really here too, all change, at least from my perspective, it starts with relationships. And that includes if you're trying to change a Ministry of Justice or a police force or whatever it might be. I'll tell you quickly a story, and I tell you this because it's illustrative. And there are other, and I love my organization, but there, International Alert, Conciliation Resources, Safer World, Interpeace, so the number of organizations that just as good work. But you start, in Nepal years ago, the police and the youth, there were fights in the streets all the time. The youth were throwing rocks, and the police were in a very heavy-handed manner coming down on them. And a survey was done, the attitudes of the population towards the police, and not surprisingly, the results were, we hate them, basically. And the results were publicized, which really embarrassed the police and made them much less likely to want to work with any citizen-led groups in a similar fashion. And we had a director at that time who was a former real youth leader himself, had a lot of credibility with youth groups in Nepal. And he went to the police leadership and he said, we'd like to do a survey too, but we'd like to co-create it with you first of all, and we'll only release the results if you're comfortable with us doing so. So okay, on that, the whole purpose here is to try to take a step towards improving relations. And the only thing that the police was kind of sweet, what they asked they only added 2 questions to the survey that our team had created. One was around what resources do people think that the police actually have? Because there were all kinds of unrealistic expectations. And in some places the police, had like a bicycle, and people expect. The other was the sweet one. It was is there anything you would thank the police for, right? And of course the response was still like 70% no, but there was the 30% yes. That provided the basis for some other things that turned into some soccer tournaments we did between the police and youth groups on the weekends. That ultimately morphed into a partnership that we now have with the police force in Kathmandu to support their rollout of a community policing approach across the whole city that is being manifested interestingly enough, in one way through a reality television show that we broadcast this past year. Young people who want to get into the police force, but they have to demonstrate community policing skills in order to do that. They get voted on, So what does that all say? That whole thing when you look at vertical cohesion, when you look at the relationship between a citizen and a governing institution, all of that started by facilitating somebody who saw their role as a facilitator, understanding what was important to the parties, and any way they could start cooperating with one another, even if something as seemingly silly as a soccer match. And in really divided societies where you have polarization and violence, it might seem really off topic. That's the only thing you can get them to do together. But if done well over time, that really makes a profound shift. So in the tech sector, I think, how do you enable those things to happen? These things take time, especially when trust has been really depleted. They don't come in one-off events. And so how do you use technology to facilitate the kind of building of those relationships and the generation of that cooperation over time? And I haven't seen a lot in that space because it's a tricky problem.
I mentioned that you work in 59 spots around the world, or have 59 offices around the world. Many of these places, there's very little infrastructure, maybe not, maybe no tech infrastructure. Where are we in this question of, can you have these tech-based solutions in some of the places where conflict are the worst? Are we moving past that challenge? Are we, and then how do you manage that challenge, and using some of these tools?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing for us is that really what these local teams do is really determined by them. So, I mean, we work very hard to build and support local teams that themselves represent the dividing lines in the community, and then really encouraging and supporting them to apply this sort of mad scientist approach to peace building, kind of try whatever might work in a local context, within the parameters of a do no harm. But you'll know if a soccer match is the right thing to do, or if that's just going to lead to people, fighting on the pitch. So that's the first. So we listen first to the community. So in answer to your question, it's interesting. In a lot of the places where we work, leveraging of technology is not at all a high. We went through a whole strategic review last year, and a lot of places where we work didn't even register as something that was remotely interesting to people. And I have to say, I mean, it's some pretty innovative people. So it's not lack of creativity for the most part. I think it does reflect somewhat this digital divide. Having said that, I think it's now nearly half of the world's 7.5 billion people have internet access. The majority of those are in developing countries, although a very small number of them, relatively, I think it was 90 million or something, the last I saw, are in the least developed countries. So just in terms of internet penetration and access, we're not there yet, but wow, we're pretty far, and every year it's just more. So, and this is a space, I think, for those, and at least for us in our field, my assumption is, there are big companies that are trying to expand this for all their own reasons. It's going to happen, and it's just getting more and more. So I wouldn't say that we're past it, because if you look at what, in a lot of the places where we work, people have really been using and looking to, technology doesn't even, it's issue number 15 out of 15. But it's just more every year.
Last question I'm going to ask. I did want to follow up on this issue of, peace building being mission critical and getting to the core business of these larger tech firms. I mean, the way that happens is, I would assume it impacts their bottom line, it impacts their ability to grow. I mean, maybe drawing on your experience in the extractive industries, I wonder if you could just say more about, not just Mark Zuckerberg's letter, but really, if you think about the core business of these organizations, how does this push forward their business proposition?
I think there's a real concern, and I think as ones get really big, they get a lot of questions from the user base about, is there a hidden agenda here? What's your hidden agenda? Whether it's around privacy issues or it's around what kind of community, how are you going to handle the news feed? How are you going to, and so I think, I highlighted his letter because it's Facebook and they're huge. I think they're 1.95 billion now. But also he put that out there in an extraordinary way, which you would only do that, if you thought it was actually quite important to the company. And they are making investments now to try and limit fake news. They're searching how to make their 5 kinds of communities real. So I think first, I think there's a concern. There's a recognition that the way that some of these tools are being used is really detrimental. I think, second, I think there's a concern with being seen as having a hidden agenda, so better to actually get out there and say proactively, this is what we stand for, these are the kinds of things and interactions, the kind of information we want people to be able to have access to that is important to them. And I don't think it's, when you look at the really big ones, it's hard to think that they have much competition from anyone right now. But I think the events of the last year have shaken a lot of people. And I do think it needs to be said, most of that sector, I think, the leadership of that sector for the large part, in this country anyway, is on the political left, and the political left lost. And I think even if you look at the discussion of filter bubbles, that is much more an issue on the left in this country than on the right. Because I think it comes out of someone who's actually much more out of touch than we thought we were with whole kinds of segments of society. So I think part of it is also generated from where the leadership of that sector sits, that they have about whether they're serving the numbers that they could be.
I'd like to throw it open to the crowd now. We've got 2 microphones, so please just raise your hand and get a mic. Moderator's plea, be brief and to the point with your questions. Feel free to introduce yourself if you'd like as well. There you go. Yeah, please.
Good evening. What efforts are being made to contact these terrorist leaders to see where we can open a dialogue? As you know, I would say about every once a month, we read that a particular terrorist leader has been killed. And to me, if they're dead, you can't talk to them. We need to talk to them. And what efforts are you making to get in touch with these terrorist leaders so we can talk to them?
One of the things that people in the peace-building field can get critiqued for, if you will, is we will talk to anyone, and more than that, we'll seek to be an open ear to anyone. Even Gandhi wrote to Hitler, right, and tried to open up a dialogue. The reality is that our field is under tremendous pressure on this issue right now. There's legislation on the books, Terrorist Support Act, that supporting terrorists is not simply giving money to a designated terrorist organization or individual. It can be providing training in negotiation, because you see that as the best way. When we worked in Burundi, there were 2 main rebel groups. One of the groups had engaged in the peace process. The other one was a holdout group. And we determined through dialogue with this group that one of the things that was keeping them from engaging in the process was that they'd never engaged in negotiations before. They thought they were going to get creamed at the table. They didn't know what it meant. So we thought, you provide negotiation training that might make it more likely that they will lay down arms and come to the table. That today, with a whole host of groups that have been designated terrorist organizations, would get you in such trouble that your organization could get shut down. So the truth of the matter, and that has been true, that was true under the Obama administration, that was true under Bush too, that's true today. And so it's one of the most chilling impacts on our field that I think is really wrong-headed. It's really self-defeating. Because you can't assume that all of those groups designated as such would be amenable to negotiations or that negotiations would work out. But I can tell you, none of them will if the effort's not made. And one of the nice things about being an organization like mine is nobody cares who we meet with. Nobody should care who we meet with. I mean, if I'm the ambassador of Afghanistan, the US ambassador to Afghanistan or whatever, and I open up a dialogue with somebody, I'm recognizing them and maybe elevating their profile, and I completely understand why you might say, you know what, we shouldn't do that before certain preconditions are made. But part of the value of citizen peace builders is nobody should care who they talk to. So this has become a real problem in the field for years. And those in the field know there's a lot of advocacy on this, but it hasn't.
Down here. Okay. Yeah, please.
Hi. I have a very basic, non-intellectually astute question. Is there a resource portal? You mentioned at the beginning of your talk about different apps like games for peace building and resources that maybe peace builders could access. Is there any kind of portal or resource hub for that you know?
So I don't know if there's an online resource for it. Others might. The next couple days here, and you can talk about CalCon, some of the people that are here and who have some startup ideas and some things that are further down the pathway. The U.S. Institute of Peace has a sort of affiliate body called PeaceTech. There is somebody here from C5 Capital who's supporting. There you are. Who's supporting the accelerator, the tech accelerator at PeaceTech, specifically for the purpose of trying to invest and provide an incubation hub for exactly these kinds of platforms and technologies. So I encourage you to connect with them or go to the PeaceTech site. But I don't know of any centralized or comprehensive resource where you could find these things.
Two suggestions. One, there is a website that's called DME for Peace. That's Design, Monitoring, and Evaluation for Peace. They've sort of expanded beyond monitoring and evaluation, where it's quite a central resource. It's not simply tech-focused, but there's quite a few resources there. Also, one of our partners with this organization, Build Up, you can go to their website, and they're a real sort of hub for this community as well. So it's a couple starting points, and from there you can kind of branch out to other folks as well.
There are a couple people back in my office who are going to kill me for not mentioning DME for Peace, but we administer DME for Peace together with. It's the largest portal for researchers and practitioners to share lessons learned, evaluation, the latest in evaluation. It's not a comprehensive portal for these tech apps and other breakthroughs, but it is. So DMNE for Peace. It's not the best. It won't roll off your tongue, but Design, Monitoring, and Evaluation for Peace.
I have a couple of questions. Is this on TED? Have you been to TED? Have you made a TED presentation?
I've done 2 TEDx, but I've never been on the big stage. No.
Okay. And also, Mark, congratulations for this. This should go live on YouTube as well.
We are live on YouTube now, and then it'll be available through our friends at UCS TV.
But as I'm a geek, so
okay.
If you think about the things that go spiral, we need to key your presentation into something that's going to go spiral, because it's a self-accelerating process. But congratulations on your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. It's very kind.
A question from the online space, and I think this goes to another one of the things. It may be a fourth challenge in regard to the tech space. Can you talk to the tension between the rapid pace change of the tech sector and the time-intensive needs of peace building and relationship building?
Yeah. One of the other lessons that we got out of this virtual exchange programming that we do, this web video conferencing platform, I love the partnership we have with these neuroscientists on it, because first of all, they're brilliant. But every time I had a conversation with them, they'd give me some new insights that were interesting. And a lot of times they sort of verified things that just in your gut you had a sense. So they talked a lot about, they did some evaluations on the young people's attitudes about one another's communities, and whether those attitudes stayed months after the program. How did they measure against control groups? Anyway, they said, there's something that everybody knows in pedagogy, which I had no clue of, but it completely reified something I'd experienced and that I lived in college, where I was extraordinarily procrastinating. In fact, in high school, the only I got in my senior year in high school, everybody got things like best dressed and whatever. I got most likely to procrastinate. Literally. Anyway, they said that there's a profound difference between spaced learning approaches and massed learning approaches. That, you can think about this: if you're taking a class and you blow off the homework all semester long, and then the night before the exam you cram like crazy, you might do well on the exam the next morning, but 48 hours later, it's kind of all out of your head. That was college for me for the most part. That's a massed learning experience. The learning experience has been massed into a very concentrated experience for you. Spaced learning happens when over time you're iteratively exposed to a learning experience such that in between those exposures, without you even realizing it, subconsciously you're making connections between things you learned and your everyday life. And it just embeds it much more in your consciousness, even in ways that you can't. And so you'll do really well on that exam, and you'll also, you'll retain it for much longer. Attitude change requires a spaced learning approach, this iterative interaction. You tend not to have one-off occasions that sort of make everything shift. I don't necessarily feel like the rapid pace of innovation for technology is at all at odds with the need for a patient and resilient approach to building these bridges. I just think that we haven't. I think it's almost embarrassing as a human race that we've done so little in this space of using technology for these purposes. I mean, it's really underutilized. It's extraordinary how little is out there. And that's not to say the things that are out there aren't valuable. There's some wonderful work, being done, and when there are natural disasters, there are ways to quickly identify who's where and how to help. There are wonderful things going on. But if you look at this core issue of how do we relate to one another, how do we solve problems that require cooperation across our dividing lines, there is so little being done. And so I don't think that's about innovation challenges. I think that's about lack of effort.
Yeah, please.
Hi, my name is Monica Kirka, and I have a question about the United States. And I think we've done a good job doing really innovative and creative projects around the world. And now we find ourselves in a really divided nation. I would say it was always divided, just the structural violence, it was kind of hidden. But now everything's coming to the surface. And how do you think, I would even ask you to name which peace-building institutions that often are based here are positioned to be able to really lead a shift in how we talk about it and even the culture change in our own country. I mean, I think that's kind of our role now. We need to shift a little bit. And I even see leading peace builders sounding a lot like activists in another country that we would be like, no, you need to love your enemy. And they're not loving their enemy very well. And so I think right now we're confronted with the reality that we're kind of those that we have been implementing upon. And what is our, what can we do, and who is situated there, and how can we support those institutions?
No, that's a great question. And there is a lot of turning inward. And yes, there is also a fair amount of hypocrisy, or at least people being confronted. Doctor, heal thyself. It can be pretty tough. There's a National Association of Community Mediators. There are 2,000 of these community mediation units all across this country. The hub for it is in Kentucky. Some of them are a couple people working out of their basement. Some of them are 50 people in an office in City Hall. They're based and have longstanding presence in mediating disputes within their communities, and we are working with them, just to be transparent. I've called with them in a week to see how we can work together, but support their efforts. And they don't need a lot to do what they're doing, but they'd like to be, I think, much more proactive and engaged in their communities, and not as much waiting for disputes to come to them to mediate. There are all kinds of efforts, living room conversations, and organizations that are trying to foster dialogue. I had a visit from Baltimore community leaders. It was like my third or fourth month on the job as president at Search for Common Ground. And in fact, when Search for Common Ground was established in 1982, and even when I joined as an unpaid intern in the summer of '93, the vision was always that we would be 50% domestic, 50% international. And the reality at that time was that we were. We had a network for life and choice that was bringing together pro-life and pro-choice activists that accomplished some extraordinary things. In some states, they co-drafted legislation to facilitate adoption, for instance, to try to deal with the issue of unwanted pregnancies. That term was acceptable to both of them in those days. So there are, and I was talking to somebody from Rotary here recently. Rotary is an incredibly decentralized institution, but Rotary is incredibly effective at leveraging resources, and a number of the Rotary clubs, including the one, as I understand it, here in this area, are really leading in supporting peace-building efforts within their communities, and that's extraordinary. We're going to be turning this virtual exchange programming inward ourselves. We're going to continue doing the international, but I don't know, when you all went to college, I don't know if this was the case for those who went to college. For me and pretty much everyone I know, after I graduated high school, everybody who went to Swarthmore College, which is where I went, got a book. They got the same book. And then when you got on campus, there were discussion groups about that book. And I don't know who started that process, but so many universities and colleges adopted that. We think it would be much more powerful and relevant for those institutions to actually have, once you get into your university and college over that summer, before you matriculate, you have a virtual exchange experience over a few weeks that specifically puts you in the room with the kinds of demographics that always segregate on campus and that are segregated in our community at large. Liberal, conservative, black, white, religious, secular, jock nerd, if they still use those terms, all that kind of stuff. So that once you get on campus, what you've got is pre-established, pretty profound connections that have been made across those very dividing lines. And the nice benefit of that as well is about a third of the young people who go through that kind of programming decide they want to be facilitators themselves. And how nice would it be for universities to have a community that's diverse of people who can facilitate, young people who can facilitate their own disputes whenever you get the almost inevitable swastika on the frat door or whatever it is. And I go into that as a self-promotional thing, but again, the Southern Poverty Law Center came out with a report that the number one site of hate incidents after the election here in the States were university campuses. And my wife's a professor at American University. They had the FBI on their campus. CNN was all over about a week ago because the first African-American student president who was elected, the day that she took office, there were bananas found hanging on nooses all across the campus. So this stuff's playing out in our campuses, and I think there are ways that we can contribute. But I would look to, and I'm sure I'm missing some extraordinary domestic organizations. So if there's a way, and I don't want to be, I'm being too self-promotional, I think if there's a way that we could maybe elevate people's awareness, maybe some of the extraordinary organizations that are already out there and doing this. We're going to be doing more of it, but there are people who were doing it brilliantly already. I'd love to find a way to do that, Andrew. Yeah.
So I'm going to paraphrase this question from Twitter a bit, but it's basically on the question, one person's moderating is another person censoring, one person's hate speech is another person's passionate speech. So, what have you learned about sort of, threading that needle in terms of the moderating you'd like to see online?
Yeah. This is a serious challenge, and one of the big questions as soon as somebody says, these are the kinds of communities we're going to create, or this is how we're going to handle the news feed so that fake news doesn't get out. Immediately, Big Brother rears its head. People go, oh, who are you? Who's going to be doing this? And our experience is that you move from the one person to diverse communities, helping to set those norms and enforce those norms, and you revisit them regularly. Any diverse society has to regularly revisit the norms by which they're going to live together and protect each other's dignity. And so how do you generate, again, if you decide we want meaningful communities, okay, is it a meaningful community if a group of extreme racists decide we can be a lot more powerful together as a community and we're going to spend a lot of time together? That's a meaningful community by one marker. But I think if we were able to say, you know what, we want to take the biggest issues in the country, the world at large. We want to identify who are all the major stakeholders, and then we want to get in a relationship with them and help them to craft what are the norms by which they're going to start talking to one another. What are the norms by which they're going to start cooperating? And one of the things, our motto at Search is understand your differences, act on your commonalities. It's not a naive, hey, just ignore the differences. No, it's understand your differences, but act on the commonalities. Again, even if that commonality is as silly as a soccer game right now, because it's the only thing you're willing to do together. And I think what we want to be doing is not saying, oh, now Big Brother's going to determine. The facilitator doesn't determine, hey, they're okay and they're not okay. It goes to the gentleman's question about who's going to talk to the terrorists, right? Whoever gets designated by whoever's in charge as terrorists today. And I think the solution to that is regularly revisiting this and having diverse members of a community that are affected by an issue, especially those who disagree on it, helping to establish those norms for one another, and then engage with one another, and ideally cooperate with one another, ultimately to help address those issues. So I don't pretend that it's an easy solution, but that's why I would love to be sitting with some of the leading tech innovators and investors to have this conversation together and get some of the best peace builders in the world and some of the best tech developers in the world, bounce us back, how would we do this? And I'm sure that what would come out of that would be much better than what either of us would come up with alone.
I think that's a great place to leave it. The many folks in the room, Shamil himself, we have a busy 2 days coming up with CalCon, so thank you very much for your time. Thanks again to the One Earth Future Foundation for being our partner with this, helping get Shamil here, what was a great discussion. So thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you.